Looking for the best Ryzen Motherboard 2022? You've come to the right place. Hi, welcome back to PC Builder. I'm Jason. This is our best motherboards for Ryzen 2022 edition, and there's been a huge number of changes in just the past year. AMD has released a lot of new CPUs, including the Ryzen 5800X3D, the Ryzen 5600, and more. We're going to cover what motherboard chipset to get for which CPU, what features you want in a motherboard, and go through specific product recommendations for every budget level to get you the best motherboard for Ryzen in 2022. If you get value in the video, give it a like, it makes a huge difference to the channel. And of course, subscribe and click that bell icon, that way you get notified when we release cool content. With that, let's jump into it. AMD has released a number of new CPUs, so let's briefly go over them. Of course, we've got the originally released Ryzen 5600X, 5800X, 5900X, and 5950X. Then, in the summer of 2021, AMD released two APUs in the Ryzen 5600G and 5700G, each with integrated graphics, but with about half the amount of cache as the Ryzen 5600X or 5800X, and only supporting PCIe Gen 3. Now recently, AMD released the Ryzen 5800X3D, the premier gaming CPU with a huge amount of cache that promised to offer the fastest gaming CPU on the AM4 platform. AMD also released cheaper versions of its Ryzen 5000 CPUs in the Ryzen 5700X, a slightly downclocked version of the 5800X, the Ryzen 5600, a slightly downclocked version of the 5600X, and the Ryzen 5500, which is a Ryzen 5600G, but without the integrated graphics. Rounding out the lineup at the low end is the Ryzen 4600G. It's similar to the 5600G, but with even less cache and on the slower Zen 2 architecture, and Ryzen 4100 and 4500, which are intended for very low budget builds. If you're wondering about the Ryzen 3000 CPUs, they've largely gone out of production, and remaining stock tends to be very overpriced. But if you're looking for a motherboard for any of the Ryzen 3000 CPUs without a G in the name, like the Ryzen 3600, then just follow the recommendations for the Ryzen 5000X series. There are four main motherboard chipsets still being offered brand new on the market: A520, B450, B550, and X570. So which one should you get? The A520 chipset motherboards are very cheap, and they're cut-down motherboards intended for ultra-budget builds. They will support any of the CPUs, but allow only for precision boost overdrive operation and not manual overclock. And they do not support PCIe Gen 4. While cheap, they're often passed over in favor of B450 motherboards if available at about the same price point. Speaking of B450 motherboards, they range from the ultra cheap to more impressive feature sets and do allow manual overclocking of the CPU. However, they do not support PCIe Gen 4. This makes them ideal for CPUs that also do not support PCIe Gen 4, like the Ryzen 5500, 5600G, 5700G, or any of the Ryzen 4000 CPUs. That brings us to the B550 and X570 chipsets, which is where owners of the Ryzen 5000 CPUs with an X and the Ryzen 5600 want to be. So what's the difference between them? Well, B550 motherboards offer all the same features as B450, as well as PCIe Gen 4, at the main GPU slot and one M.2 slot. As a class, B550 generally offers the best features for PCIe Gen 4 CPUs at the best price point, and they're ideal for gaming systems. Only thing that X570 offers over B550 is extra PCIe Gen 4 at the auxiliary PCIe slots and the remaining M.2 slots, often at a significantly higher cost. So I only recommend X570 if you're doing professional level workloads that require heavy writes to multiple Gen 4 SSDs. So for 95% of you who don't do that kind of work, you just want to get a B550 motherboard, unless of course you find a great deal on an X570. And just to emphasize the point, X570 does not give you any additional future proofing over B550, it just spends more of your money that you could have used upgrading something else like the graphics card, the memory, cooler, storage, or more. Or of course, adding a whole bunch of RGB. Let's talk X570 versus X570S. Now, the original X570 motherboards launched with a small proprietary chipset fan in the bottom right-hand corner of the board. These fans can fail, and they would then need to be replaced. So the newer X570S boards have been introduced without the chipset fan and instead use passive cooling, while otherwise maintaining the same features. So if you are looking to get an X570 board, I'd recommend getting an X570S if you can. Let's talk about the BIOS, and this is a very important section, do not skip it. BIOS is essentially the operating system for the motherboard, And in order for your system to post, you're going to need a BIOS version that works with your CPU. Now, as AMD has released new CPUs, some motherboard makers have been quick to update their BIOS in their boards being shipped out, and some have not. That is why I continue to strongly recommend that you get a motherboard with BIOS flashback. This is something that Gigabyte calls QFlash Plus, which allows you to update the BIOS without a compatible CPU. Now, this is really easy to do, and I have a whole separate step-by-step video guide on how to do it, and I'll leave a link to that down in the video description. For the Ryzen 5800X3D, I would only buy motherboards that have BIOS flashback, as that definitely needs a BIOS update. For Ryzen 5000X CPUs, and likely the 5600, you're probably going to be safe buying any B550 or X570 motherboard. For the Ryzen 5600G and 5700G, and presumably the 5500, I continue to recommend B450 boards with BIOS flashback, as well as for the Ryzen 4000 CPUs. Remember, there are plenty of good boards of every chipset that have BIOS flashback, so it just seems like the smart thing to get one. So what motherboard features do you need? The real difference between motherboards of the same chipset is essentially what features they offer. So let's start off with form factor, or basically, what size motherboard are you looking to buy? There are going to be three primary form factors. There's full-size ATX, a 2/3 size called micro ATX, or mATX for short, and a miniature size motherboard with only one PCIe slot called an ITX motherboard intended for small form factor builds. Now, most of you will likely either want a full-size ATX or micro ATX motherboard, but we'll also go through some ITX motherboards in our recommendations. Now, note the PC case you buy, it needs to fit the motherboard, and while small motherboards will fit in the larger cases, ATX motherboards will not fit in cases designed exclusively for smaller boards, so check the size compatibility before you buy a case. Let's talk about the motherboard power delivery, also known as the VRM. It's the half square right here that delivers power to the CPU. Now, the quality of the VRMs is going to ensure that your CPU doesn't thermally throttle due to the VRMs overheating. Generally, the more cores the CPU has, the more power it draws, and the more you're going to need a solid VRM with good cooling. Manually overclocking the CPU is also going to increase the load on the VRMs and in turn the heat as well. Even boards with nice looking heatsinks can be a problem if the VRM components are undersized or poorly configured. For 6 and 8 core CPUs running at stock or just using Precision Boost Overdrive, most of the B550 motherboards and the mid-tier and above X570 motherboards will be just fine. This isn't much of a concern with the B450 motherboards, as we're generally using only 4 or 6 core CPUs with them. The B550 and X570 motherboards in our recommendations have all been tested by third parties to ensure that they meet the necessary requirements. Rear I/O and front panel connectors are one of the bigger things that separates many of the motherboards. The more connections provided at higher speeds mean that we can plug in more high-speed devices. Generally, we'd like to see at least 4 high-speed USB 3.1 or better connections with a couple of slower 2.0 USB ports for mice, keyboards, and other low bandwidth devices. For the front panel PC case connectors, most motherboards will accommodate at least 2 front panel USB Type-A connections of 3.1 speed or higher, and 2 front panel USB connections that are 2.0 speed. Some motherboards have a front panel USB Type-C connector in order to activate the front panel USB Type-C port available on some PC cases. For networking, modern motherboards come with at least one wired 1 gigabit per second LAN connection. Given that most people only connect to the internet and that their internet speeds are generally below 1 gigabit per second, that's generally all you need. Some boards come with Wi-Fi and Bluetooth built in. Note that you can of course buy a PCIe add-in Wi-Fi and Bluetooth card for about $30 with Wi-Fi 6, or buy a USB Wi-Fi 5 adapter for about $20. Onboard audio. It can either be really important or not important at all. If you're plugging in an analog connector, it's going to be something that you should think about. If instead you're plugging in a sound device with a digital connection like HDMI or USB connections, then you're bypassing the onboard motherboard audio processing and instead using the secondary device for digital to analog conversion. Budget audio codecs can sound fine, and they are typically in the 800 series such as the ALC 897. More premium audio codecs have better overall signal to noise ratios and additional audio signal boosts for front panel headphones like the ALC 1100 or 1200. The best audio codec for AM4 motherboards is the ALC 1220, which offers additional encoding and decoding support as well as support for high impedance headphones. Let's talk storage. While the A520 and B450 boards are PCIe Gen 3 storage only, they will have between 4 and 8 SATA connections, at least one M.2 connection, with 2 M.2 ports on some of the higher end B450 boards. For B550 and X570, these boards will support PCIe Gen 4 SSDs and include at least 2 M.2 ports, and on some of the higher end X570 and B550 boards, up to 4 M.2 slots. All right, let's start off with the best B450 and A520 motherboards. These are for budget builds that are using CPUs that don't have PCIe Gen 4, like the Ryzen 5500, the 5600G, 5700G, and all of the Ryzen 4000 CPUs. Obviously, you can also use them for the Ryzen like 5600X and higher, or the 5600 that have PCIe Gen 4, but I wouldn't. I would spend a little bit more money on a B550, and we'll get to those in just a moment. Let's start off at the ultra budget range, and this is a motherboard that I think is really good. This is the ASUS Prime B450 M-A2 II. As long as you get the current ones, you don't get the old one, you get the ones with the II after it, these all have BIOS flashback. I really like this board. Number one, it's $79. Hard to beat at that price point. And if you look at the connectivity you get, it's pretty insane. 4 USB 3.2 Gen 1 ports and 2 USB 3.2 Gen 2 ports. Now the one thing is, if you're doing an APU build, it does not have DisplayPort. Don't necessarily need DisplayPort. HDMI is absolutely fine if you're doing like a 5600G or 4600G. For $79, this is an absolute steal for any of the low-end builds. Let me give you a couple alternatives, because so many B450 boards are either no longer on the market with BIOS flashback, or the ones that are there don't have BIOS flashback. I want to give you some A520 alternatives. The first one is the Gigabyte A520M DS3H, very popular motherboard lineup, DS3H by Gigabyte. However, the A520, this does not have a heatsink over the main VRMs. I don't love that, and I would only use 4 or 6 core CPUs here maximum. Probably find something else for the 5700G. It does lose a little bit of connectivity in that it's only got 4 high-speed USB ports and 2 slower 2.0 ports, but you do pick up a DisplayPort as well as HDMI. Not a bad pickup for $78 if you can't find the B450 in your region. The other one to take a look at is the Gigabyte A520M Aorus Elite. Very similar to the DS3H, except this does have a heatsink on it. I would feel fine with the 5700G on this one. Same connectivity. For some reason, it loses the DisplayPort. I don't understand why. They're basically the same motherboard. But overall, those are good ones to look at. If you want Wi-Fi and all the trimmings on an A520, the ASUS Tough Gaming A520M Plus Wi-Fi, $92. This is a really good pickup. So not only does it come with about the same level of connectivity that we saw from the Gigabyte boards in terms of the same USB ports, but we add in the Wi-Fi and we retain both the DVI and the HDMI port. That's really great. Again, $92. This is one I would strongly consider in the ultra budget level. If you're looking for something more premium, including better audio, you want an additional M.2 slot with a heatsink on it, look no further than the ASUS Tough Gaming B450M Pro S. This board has tons of connectivity to it. It's got 4 higher speed USB 3.2 Gen 1 ports, got the BIOS flashback, of course, and in addition to that, it's got 2 higher speed ports, 3.2 Gen 2, including a Type-C on it, and it throws in a couple of USB 2.0 ports just for good measure. It's got both the DisplayPort and HDMI port. That's great for APU builds. Got a full suite of audio connectors, and as I said, it has the ALC 1200 audio codec on it. Pretty amazing little motherboard for just $99. I know right now they've got it for $70. You're not going to be able to find it for that. That's with a rebate, but if you can, that's phenomenal. Even at $100 or $110, this board will be well worth it. And of course, if you're looking for all those same features, but you want a full-size ATX motherboard, then the ASUS Tough Gaming B450 Plus 2 is basically the same identical board, except it's ATX sized instead. Let's go through some of the budget-oriented B550 motherboards. These are motherboards you'll find often at the $100 price range. The features on these are going to be pretty cut down. You're going to get kind of mediocre audio quality in the ALC 800 series codecs. You're going to get 2 M.2 slots, which is great. You're going to get okay USB connectivity, and the VRMs on these, I would go 5600, 5600X, 5800X, 5900X at stock, but I would not go any higher than that. I would definitely invest more in the motherboard, especially if you're going to spend that much on a CPU. The Gigabyte B550M DS3H, great little motherboard. Typically find it anywhere from $90 to $110. It's got two M.2 slots, as do most B550s. It's got a decent amount of rear connectivity. It's got four higher speed USB ports, four lower speed USB 2.0 ports on it, just a regular suite of audio connectors. Nothing really super special about this board other than the VRMs will definitely take the CPUs that I just laid out. Four DIMM slots on it. Kind of is what it is. Four SATA ports. Not bad if you're looking to do something ultra budget. There is a Wi-Fi enabled version of it for about $10 more. The other alternative I would definitely take a look at is the MSI B550M Pro VDH Wi-Fi, particularly if you have a case that needs the front panel USB Type-C port. This is the front panel USB port right there, if you can see that through this. It's the 20-pin connector. Otherwise, very similar to the Gigabyte board, similar amount of connectivity. You do lose two of the 2.0 ports. Maybe that's important to you if you like to plug in a lot of peripheral devices like mice and keyboards. Otherwise, the VRMs on this, a little bit better than the Gigabyte board, but nothing to write home about for sure. Again, if you're looking to spend a limited amount of money, and this board often you can find for about $100, might be the way to go. If you're looking for more of a premium experience for a B550 micro ATX motherboard, the Gigabyte B550M Aorus Pro-P has been my go-to recommendation. $130 sometimes can be found for cheaper than that. VRMs on this board are pretty good. I'd recommend up to a 5900X. If you're gonna do something higher than that, I would definitely go with another motherboard, but that's gonna be my recommendation for anything under $130. You get the nice heat shield over the M.2 slot, you get upgraded audio, ALC 1200, and you get quite a bit more connectivity. You get four USB 2.0 ports, you get six higher speed ports, including a Type-C, 2.5 gigabit Realtek LAN. You get the full suite of audio outputs on it, a number of fan connections as well, and RGB headers that you didn't have on the previous boards. Overall, it just looks nicer too. Nice little motherboard. If you're looking for something that also has Wi-Fi built in, check out the ASUS TUF Gaming B550M Plus Wi-Fi. Pretty good little motherboard. You can also find the non-Wi-Fi version of this for about $135, $140, not that much more than the Gigabyte Pro-P if you don't like a Gigabyte board, if you're looking for something more like an ASUS board. Very, very similar feature set though. This one just includes Wi-Fi. However, the price on this has creeped up, at least in the US, to about $155, sometimes even $165. Typically sits around $140 though. And it's a great alternative if you're looking for Wi-Fi with the same feature set. Now let's jump into the best B550 motherboards under $200. And I think this is where the majority of owners of the 5600, 5600X, 5900X, 5800X, 3D, etc., all the way up to the 5950X are gonna wanna be. These are phenomenal boards. They all have upgraded audio. They all have heat shields on at least one of the M.2s, multiple PCIe slots, great USB connectivity. Some of them have front panel USB Type-C connectors. Let's go through the boards, starting off with the Gigabyte B550 Aorus Elite. Note, there's a B550M version of this. You don't want that board. It's not a very good board. You want the full ATX size of it. It's actually a completely different motherboard. Great USB connectivity in the rear, 6 high-speed ports. You don't get the Type-C here, by the way, but you do get the 2.5 gigabit Realtek LAN, full suite of audio connectors, and you also get 2 additional USB 2.0 connectors. That's down from the B550M Pro, but still pretty good in terms of connectivity. But for $135 with the ALC 1200 audio, you get a heat shield on the top M.2, a number of fan and RGB headers. Really nice little motherboard for, again, $135. It's hard to beat. If you want Wi-Fi, another great deal, at least right now in the US, is the ASUS TUF Gaming B550 Plus Wi-Fi. This is a phenomenal motherboard, very similar connectivity to the board we just looked at, but you do get the Type-C on this, as well as you get the Wi-Fi, which is really, really nice. Full suite of audio connectors. We're still talking about ALC 1200 audio codec on this. You get a number of fan and RGB headers. Great VRMs overall on it. Hard to beat for $140. In fact, at the current pricing, I would definitely grab this over the Gigabyte board, even if I didn't need the Wi-Fi, because you can always use the Bluetooth for something. If you are looking for that front panel USB Type-C header, it is a little harder to get. You mostly find it on the more premium motherboards if you also want upgraded audio and some of the other features. Obviously, almost all the MSI boards have it. So yes, the MSI, like some of the MSI boards I wouldn't necessarily recommend, would have it if that's all you're looking for. Otherwise, check out like the Gigabyte Aorus Elite AX V2. All the V2 motherboards for the Aorus line, including the Pro, have the USB Type-C connector. What they're doing though is they're trading out a little bit of rear panel connectivity, although on this board not much. They're trading out a little bit of it in order to power that front panel USB Type-C header. This board also has Wi-Fi on it. This is, I believe, like $179, so $180. The other ones to take a look at is the Tomahawk. If you don't need the Wi-Fi, $168. It's basically the Aorus. It does have a little bit less USB rear connectivity. That's the unfortunate thing about the Tomahawk and its Wi-Fi version, the Gaming Edge Wi-Fi. But otherwise, ALC 1200 audio codec, got at least 2 heat shields on it, a bevy of fan and USB headers. The only reason I usually recommend this board is for the front panel connectors. If people don't want the Gigabyte board, that's typically a better value. And then the Gaming Edge Wi-Fi is just that same Tomahawk board with Wi-Fi. Why they decide to call it something else, who knows? I guess they sell more motherboards that way. Rounding out the best motherboards under $200, let's jump to the high end of this. You're gonna find ALC 1220 audio codec, so that's support for high impedance headphones. You're gonna find even more USB connectivity, even better VRMs on these boards. These are kind of the cream of the crop, and there's really 2 sets of boards I'm gonna recommend here. The first one is the Gigabyte B550 Aorus Pro AC. We use this in our 5900X build, phenomenal motherboard. The AC version, again, has Wi-Fi, and the V2 version has the front panel USB Type-C connector if you need that. This board right here, just the AC version, tons of USB rear connectivity to it, including a Type-C, everything you've come to expect from the Aorus Elite, but this board probably has the best-in-class VRM heatsink on it, under $200 of any of the motherboards I'm showing you. Again, they're all capable of running a 5950X overclocked. So this one just happens to run cooler if that's important to you. All the other boards are fully capable of it, of course. Tons of fan and RGB headers to it. Great motherboard right now for $165 over at Newegg. This is a steal. This board can go up to about $200 at times, but often goes on sale for less than that. And then the other boards I want to recommend to you are the ASUS ROG Strix B550-A and the B550F. What's the difference between the two? Well, the B550F also comes in a Wi-Fi version that usually is about $200 for it. We use the B550F Wi-Fi in our 5600X best gaming build. That's a video on the channel if you want to check that out. Great motherboard overall. Really do love the onboard audio on it. It's got a great audio section to it. Good rear panel connectivity. The only difference between the F and the A is that the F has support for a feature that nobody uses anymore, which is AMD Crossfire for multiple AMD GPUs. Nobody does that anymore, so don't even bother asking what it is. It's just completely obsolete. I do see the A version of it used quite a bit in all white builds, especially now that some of the other specialty boards that we'll get to in a moment seem to be heavily out of stock. So this is a great motherboard for an all white version, especially once you fill it out with other all white components. $175 for both of them, about $200 for the Wi-Fi version of the B550F. Let's jump into 2 specialty build B550s real quick, both by NZXT. If you're looking for a themed all black or all white build, the NZXT N7 B550 is really great motherboard. Finding all black motherboards not as hard with the color scheme, but if you want something absolutely jet black, good motherboard here by NZXT, $250, has a lot of rear panel connectivity, including a Type-C on it, including the Wi-Fi, BIOS flashback, the whole deal, and just looks really phenomenal in a build. The white version, very hard to find at times, often goes completely out of stock for up to a month at a time. But these also do have the front panel USB Type-C. $280 for the white version right now, $250 version for the all black version. So you definitely are paying a price premium. But if you're looking to do a themed build, these are definitely the boards that I would pick. Let's quickly go through 2 production workload oriented B550 motherboards. The first is if you want a ton of M.2 storage and you don't necessarily need all of it being Gen 4 speeds, then the B550 Unify is a great motherboard. It's got 4 M.2s, all with heat sinks on them. Fantastic. Adds a couple of other nifty little features like the postcode up there if you're into overclocking. Good overall audio on it. Does trade out a little bit of the USB rear connectivity, but not a ton. Certainly plenty of connectivity back here. Only 2.5 gigabit Realtek LAN. Would have been nice to see 10 on a more production kind of oriented board, but 2.5 is going to satisfy most users. Wi-Fi on it. And then of course we've got the Gigabyte B550 Vision D-P. Now why is this board special? Because it's one of the only, I think maybe only motherboard, B550 that has Thunderbolt support. So if you were in a production-oriented environment and you really are built into the Thunderbolt protocol, then here you go. You've got 2 of them on the rear panel there. You've got a ton of other USB rear connectivity. You've got dual 2.5 gigabit Realtek LAN, just a ton of features. Obviously the BIOS flashback, the Wi-Fi, the upgraded audio that you would expect on any of the Aorus boards. Here you go right here for $280 for this board. It can often get down to $240, but I would even buy it at $280 if you're looking for the Thunderbolt support. Let's jump into X570 motherboards. Again, remember, this is only if you need a lot of M.2 or more than one M.2 PCIe Gen 4 device or other PCIe Gen 4 devices in the PCIe slots here. That is a very small segment of the market. For gamers, B550. This is one motherboard to check out, which is a Gigabyte X570 Aorus Elite Wi-Fi. It's very similar to the Aorus Elite B550 V2AX version. The Wi-Fi in this is a little slower. This is going to be Wi-Fi 5, I believe. On the Aorus Elite, it's going to be Wi-Fi 6. I'd probably pick that one up. Does have the front panel USB Type-C header. But again, if you're looking for X570, great audio on this motherboard. It's got ALC 1200. It's got a little bit more rear panel USB connectivity. I think it's got one additional slot than its B550. Great motherboard overall if you want X570 on the cheap. Then of course we've got the ASRock X570 Tai-Chi. This is a very nice motherboard. It has additional, I believe this one has 3 M.2s on it. Great motherboard by ASRock. People probably wonder, well, why haven't I recommended more ASRock motherboards? Well, for the simple fact that they don't include BIOS flashback in almost any of their motherboards except for the super high-end ones, and the B550 Tai-Chi, in my opinion, not worth the money, but the ASRock X570 Tai-Chi here definitely has BIOS flashback, especially if you're going to get the 5800X 3D CPU and you want a motherboard. Great USB connectivity, great Wi-Fi on it. Includes the postcode at the bottom, so that's a great addition for $300, and you get the addition of another M.2 slot to it. Overall, if I were looking for a production-oriented motherboard under $300, this is the one I would definitely pick. If you can't afford to spend just a little bit more money, this is the motherboard we used in our Ryzen 5950X video editing PC, Gigabyte X570S. That means it drops the proprietary chipset fan down here and it's passively cooled, which is phenomenal. This has a phenomenal VRM. It's all finned, a VRM heatsink on it. Probably one of the best VRMs of any motherboard in any of the either X570 or B550s. Has 4 M.2 slots, all of them PCIe Gen 4. So if you want to just load a motherboard up with a ton of M.2 storage, this is a great motherboard. Tons of rear panel connectivity to it. It's also got the clear CMOS and as well as the Q flash. That's what Gigabyte calls BIOS flashback button on it. For $350, if you're just heavily into video editing or lots of production workloads, this is definitely a motherboard that I would get, and we did get it. And of course, if you don't mind spending all the monies, that's the ASUS ROG Crosshair 8 Dark Hero. Now again, this is a motherboard. To me, it's an X570S. It doesn't have the proprietary chipset fan, which is great. It's passively cooled. We love that. Only 2 M.2s on this board. A little disappointing with that. Yeah, I could have used a little bit more. But if you're looking for rear panel connectivity, this has it all. Just absolute tons of it. Great connectors. It's got, just like the Gigabyte Aorus master board, the BIOS flashback, the clear CMOS on it. Great RGB on it, phenomenal audio. I don't really see the advantage of this board over the Gigabyte board, but I know some people don't like Gigabyte boards and they really prefer ASUS. If that's where you're at, this is the board to buy for $450. Really quickly on ITX boards, if you're looking for a small form factor build and need ITX, the board I would really go with is the ASUS ROG Strix B550-I. Typically find it for around $200, sometimes lower. Right now it's $185 over at Newegg. It has a passive cooling for the chipset, which is great. Good rear panel USB connectivity, Wi-Fi on it, great audio on it. Like I said, the front panel USB Type-C connector to it. This is the board that I would probably start with. If you got value in the video, give it a like. It makes a big difference to the channel. And of course, subscribe and click that bell icon. That way you get notified when we release cool content. Let me know down in the comments, are there boards that you feel like I missed? Or is there a question that you have on a particular board? We're trying to get back to everybody if we can. If you're looking for even more cool content, I'm going to give you 2 links. One to the best Ryzen 5000 coolers right here, and one to a series called Boost My Build right here, where we take your PC part picker list, we tear them up, we put them back together, and we massively boost up your performance. It's a lot of fun, and you might just learn a lot too about how to get the best price to performance in your build. With that, I'll catch you on the next one.